So the history of the Bowie knife is pretty muddled. But most people agree that the knife that Jim Bowie had on him, that he used to defend his life and become infamous at the sandbar fight, did not look like this. Now, certain of these features he himself added later after that experience in designing his own carry knife, and the rest, well, we'll talk about that evolution going forward. But most accounts agree that the knife he was carrying on him as a backup weapon, just in case the day's events went catastrophically wrong, and they absolutely did, was described as a sheath knife in the shape of a large butcher knife with about a 9-inch blade, 1.5 inches wide. No clip point, no false edge, no guard, just some riveted on handle scales. So maybe we're talking about something a little bit more like this. Out of the box edge. Now this is basically a flat grind with a secondary bevel that is apple seated, but you can pretty much see in the camera's focus that it's pretty ragged, pretty high grit grind on it. Now it's a 1075 high carbon steel that my test files are saying it's actually somewhere between 50 and 55 HRC, so a bit on the soft side, more in the sword range, but this is designed to be a chopper versus a slicer, and we'll see how the edge holds up. But let's test it against some paper. Is it shaving sharp out of the box? No. Okay, that is definitely toothy, but not too bad. I'm betting I can improve it, but we'll see. How about some cardboard? And we'll definitely also talk about how the finish plays into the equation as well. But yeah, definitely some resistance due to probably the toothiness of the edge. A lot of other reviewers have praised the quality of Condor sheaths, and I'm going to have to agree with them here. It's a good quality, thick leather sheath that's well put together. This one comes with a swiveling belt loop, and we'll talk about that in carry and handling. Now, the knife and the sheath were shipped separately in the box, but I didn't have any break-in struggle fitting the knife into the sheath, especially given how the grip sits about halfway in. And right now, the retention is actually pretty good. I expect that'll loosen up with break-in over time. But I do have one issue with this setup. Given how much of that grip is inside the sheath and then the shape of the exposed end of it, I don't have much real estate for my hand to grab onto, and the shape doesn't really grab my hand back. So sometimes, yes, I do fumble with drawing. It's just not as positive as I'd like it to be. Let's go ahead and talk about specs, build quality, fit and finish before I do my durability tests and we talk about handling. Already talked about the out-of-the-box edge in terms of that kind of wide secondary apple-seated edge grind. 1075 high carbon steel, which I'm used to having on a lot of my more durable through-hardened swords. And speaking of through-hardened swords, my file's telling me the Rockwell hardness is somewhere between 50 and 55, which I'm used to in a sword, but seems a little low for a knife. So we'll see how the steel and the hardness holds up under some chopping and such. Speaking of holding up, okay, so you've got a plain square spine with kind of a broken back drop point, very, very butcher knife looking. Am I going to add a false edge to this? Actually, no. But flat ground, you've heard me complain endlessly at this point probably about how much I hate traction coatings. All right, I have no problem with DLC or patinas or bluing or oxide coatings like parkerization, but I hate traction coatings. However, this, what I would consider kind of an extreme acid wash, stone wash, that makes it look hand-forged and antiqued. I actually really like this, but we'll see how it holds up. And do some chopping and batoning and such with it. Speaking of holding up, okay. Walnut grips attached with what look like 3 fairly sturdy brass pins. Are these going to come loose under impact? How are they going to translate impact back into my hand? We'll find out. But you've also, if you've seen my previous big knife videos, heard me complain frequently about big square chonky grips. Okay, these grips are basic slabs of wood, flat on the sides, but everything is nicely rounded. So spoiler alert for handling, it does feel really good in my hand, holding it, moving it around. How's it going to feel under impact? Don't know yet. But I did already mention one problem I've got with the grip shape. It is a bit short, especially if you have bigger hands. Mine are medium width. But coming out of the sheath with half of the sheath buried in the leather, I only have a little bit to grab onto, and there's no real shape here to retain my hand. Is that also going to be a problem under use and impact? Is this going to be likely to slip out of my grip? Now, I can hook my thumb over the top of one of the scales for extra retention, but yeah, we'll see if it's slippy. You'll notice it doesn't have a hole in it to add a lanyard, so that might be an issue. We'll find out. Also, impact going in the other direction. How is it going to feel in thrusting and stabbing, collisions between my fingers and this base of the blade that serves as a guard? Well, we'll find out. I'm not going to improve it before I do that. But some specifications. First number I'm going to throw out at you. I paid about $77 US for this on Amazon. You can also get it for about the same price at Chicago Knife Works. I'll put some links down in the description. So not a huge investment, huge risk to try out a new knife, a new company. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you if I feel like I got my money's worth or maybe even more. But your blade length on this one, all right, I did talk about the specs given for that original Bowie knife. This would be a little shorter but a little wider. So 8.5-inch blade, about 22 centimeters, with the widest point being 2.25 inches, so about 5.5 centimeters. And thickness at spine, no, there's no distal taper. But that's a pretty impressive 5 millimeters. So pretty stout knife. Grip length, okay, I have trouble figuring out how to functionally measure this, so I'm just measuring the whole thing. The whole thing is 4.5 inches, so about 11.5 centimeters, giving it an overall length of 13 3/8 inches, so about 34 centimeters. How heavy is it? Almost exactly 1 pound, so about 453 grams. Point of balance, a bit into the blade, probably because the handle's so small. But only about 1 inch away from the top of the grip scale, so about 2.5 centimeters into the blade. And we will definitely talk about how that feels in handling, but let me go ahead and run some of my impact and durability tests, and we'll see how it does. All right, here we are post-testing. How did it do? Well, first I have to give you my caveat that if you're looking for hard bushcraft testing, it's not something you're going to see on my channel. Hopefully I can give you the collectors and the martial practitioners' perspectives. A lot of other YouTubers have put this knife to really hard field testing though, so definitely check out those videos. The knife has proven itself to be durable. But there are some tests that I run to check the durability of the build and the edge and to see how it translates impact back into me during use. So test number 1, thrusting and stabbing into my pel. Stab him. Stab him is multiple layers of thick cardboard over a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper over wood. And frankly, it was kind of like stabbing it with a sharpened shovel. Made some really big wide holes, but not very deep ones. And yes, that kind of slippy shape of the handle, my hand was consistently slamming into the base of the blade. So I did round it off a little bit after I did that test, just way too uncomfortable. And that was in the forward grip and the reverse grip. Now I even went as far as reversing the blade facing towards me North American Bowie style, which because it doesn't have a sharpened clip point doesn't make any sense. But I wanted to see if it was any better if that projection was more into the padded, web between my thumb and forefinger. And that was a little bit better, but still not the most comfortable thing to thrust with. Again, kind of sharpened shovel-ish. But then on to edge testing. And some people think that this is an abusive test where I hack, chop, slash, dry bamboo. I'm specifically looking for a fragile edge, something easy to chip or roll, and it came away with, well, not a scratch. Next test, put it to some utility use, shaved on some boards, worked really well as a tool, though I would have to say, well, I'm getting the sense that maybe this rough finish is not working in its favor. I also hadn't improved the edge yet, so it was still working with that really rough edge. I chopped into some boards. It's a really great chopper, felt really good chopping. Nothing came loose, nothing got damaged. Finish looks perfect. Batoned through some kiln-dried firewood, which tends to be very inconsistent. In the same log, some pieces will fall apart and other pieces are like concrete. So it depends on where I'm catching it. And yeah, it did okay, but it did sort of struggle a bit. And I think it's because I've got a big old wide and relatively thin blade. So it's not really conducive to acting like any kind of splitting maul. But when I was able to get it through, it got through just fine. In other areas, it did kind of bind up and stick. I don't know how much is the blade profile or the blade finish, but the blade finish held up just fine. Edge held up just fine. I went ahead and then did a couple of tests off camera. I had a bunch of cardboard I needed to cut into sections that I'm going to be using for target practice in some side-by-side comparisons, but I figured while I was at it, took a handful of knives that I'm currently reviewing, do a little preliminary side-by-side comparison. Cutting through thick cardboard, yeah, this just didn't do very well with the factory edge. But I went ahead and then improved it on some fine belts, went back to the task, and it was much, much, much better. It's still not as good as some of the other knives that I was testing, and that will come back to us when I do the side-by-side comparison. Don't know how much of it's the edge, how much of it is the broadness of the blade, and how much of it is any friction binding I'm getting from the surface. Speaking of which, I also went ahead and, well, considering the shape of the knife, did a little food prep side-by-side with some other blades. But what I can tell you is, yeah, with the edge improved, it's a nice slicey knife, but it is a fairly thick one, thicker than you think. So you do have to adjust your cutting angle to get nice fine slices, but it can certainly work for food prep either as a fine slicer or butcher knife or a cleaver. So yes, it does have some potential there. Now, did have to, put a little bit more effort into cleaning off that surface after using it that way, but it worked just fine. Otherwise, it's very comfortable in the hand, but not the most secure grip for certain things that I tend to do with a knife. So let's go ahead and talk about my martial handling impressions. Redirecting you to the unflattering waistline view so we can talk about carry. This swivel sheath is kind of growing on me. I've complained in the past about sheaths that hang too low and dangle loosely, flop around. I prefer something that's a little higher on my hip and firm to my waist, so not only can I find it consistently, but I've got something to pull against in the draw. This one gives me the best of both worlds, I think. It is reasonably high on the hip, but it's also very firm and secure. Definitely gives me something to pull against. But that swivel does allow the knife to move with me, move out of my way, especially for things like sitting down. And as you can tell, sitting down is something I like to do a lot. But, all right, when it comes to wear, offside versus strong side, my preference for wearing the knife strong side is having it edge forward. And obviously the sheath doesn't give me that option. It's one direction only. But it does give me a couple of other options. One, for a conventional draw, I can catch what's exposed of the butt, hopefully get a couple of fingers on it, rotate the knife this way, and pretty smoothly draw it that way without bringing my arm too far to the rear. Now, for my arthritic old shoulder, it is a little bit awkward to resheath it that way, and one of the other things you're going to immediately see is, yes, already with break-in, the knife is dropping in pretty readily, so that also means retention is steadily decreasing. But a couple of other options to talk about. Can I reach around and use my preferential cavalry draw? Well, I don't have a whole lot to grab onto. That is indeed pretty awkward, and I do get a little bit of that twist that becomes a problem with certain knives that widen out here at the belly. Sometimes they snag in the leather sheath and it becomes a two-stage process. Doesn't happen all the time. It's improving with break-in, but that's still an issue. Now, my third option is just getting thumb and forefinger and maybe my second finger on here so I can grab it in reverse ice pick. Yeah, that works pretty smoothly. Now, obviously, it's coming out with edge towards me, so I'm going to have to use it that way initially in a pinch, or speaking of pinch, I can flip it to the forward grip. So let's go ahead now and talk about the handling. Let's start by talking about the grip and the mechanics. Feels really good in hand using it as a utility tool and just moving it around, but especially secure when I lock my thumb over the top of that grip scale, which is not only good for certain utility uses, but martially speaking, for certain close-in actions where I want that really firm grip on the knife and a hammer grip for stabbing and close range slashing and chopping actions, versus choking further down on it to get the leverage and the reach for some of those quicker snap cuts. Choking down on this knife does not feel very secure in my hand at all, so not recommended. This one is definitely telling me choke up and use it like this. And then we need to talk about the tip. We'll be doing side-by-side comparisons, but I've described my extremes in tip geometry as being the needle versus the shovel. One is maximized for penetration and the other one basically for impact. This one's definitely a shovel, but I've worked with a lot of martial knives and swords, like Chinese butterfly swords or certain kind of sabers, that, yeah, big broad tips, not much of a point, so not designed for stabbing and thrusting. Can you still do it? Yes. Is it going to have a certain kind of effect? Absolutely. But maybe not the one that you prefer. But when it comes to cutting, moving it around, yeah, it does feel really comfortable in the hand. It is pretty responsive, and even choked up on it, I can get some nice snap cuts going, some good slashes. It does feel like it's got the power and the blade presence for chopping. Speaking of blade presence, okay, it doesn't have nearly the length I would want for doing any kind of parrying or blocking, no guard whatsoever, so my tactics with this are going to be definitely evasive and relying on something in my offhand. But I can strike with the spine. I can strike with the flat in some of those techniques. I've almost got enough leading edge here that I can do some of those punching, jabbing actions. Is there enough grip here to pommel strike with? There is, at least with my hands. And the taper almost works for that, especially, again, when I have my thumb locked in. But No back edge, no real clip point. Flipping it around this way, yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless I'm looking for blunt striking or wanting certain kinds of stabbing geometry. We'll talk about that as we go forward in comparisons of different Bowie knives. Reverse grip. Okay, it is thin enough for Mike to do his finger twirl, which I don't recommend for its lack of security. Pinch flipping. All right, I would prefer a little bit more something down here to do a pinch flip, but the roundness of that butt end does make it pretty smooth for pinch flipping. And in the reverse grip, that belly does allow for really good slashes. Stabbing, again, we're talking about a shovel, so impact versus penetration. Having the edge towards me, well, I'm losing any potential for slashing on this side, but yeah, it still could certainly be used that way depending on what your own preferences are, the systems that you are studying. So I think it's an interesting tool to give me a sense of what big knife martial practices might have been when something like this was carried as your field utility tool, but you could still use it in a pinch in a fight if things went sideways on you, which is exactly what happened to Jim Bowie. After that sandbar fight, he made certain improvements, evolved this knife into, well, some of it was him and some of it was the knife manufacturers trying to create something that would sell, that would appeal to the public. And obviously martial practitioners going forward, they put their own influences on that design evolution. But here we have a look back at, okay, what was that knife before it was, well, that knife? All right, have a couple of other Condors coming in that we're going to take a look at, and a couple of other non-cold steel knives coming in that we're going to take a look at and add into our equation. But for now, let me cut this off. Have any questions about this? If you have one of these, have any recommendations for other Condor products or any other big knives, please keep those coming. Otherwise, as usual, thank you for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, and I do hope to see you back for wherever this is going.